G'day guys, welcome back to the workshop. This is part of a collaboration with Alex from Valhalla Ironworks. A while back we discussed the idea of doing a collaboration in which I would show how to do Hamones on a blade that he forged. So with life kind of got in the way and it took us a while to get around to it, but I received the package today and what I'm going to do is go through how I go about grinding this blade prior to Hormone heat treatment, and then how I go through the heat treatment itself. Now, drum roll please. Here is the blade. Actually no. Here is the blade, although I don't see much difference. No. But yeah, it's a relatively small blade, so that I can work on it relatively quickly between projects. It's a 3-inch blade with about 3/4 inches of depth. And it is about, I'd say 3/16 thick. He's left it quite chunky out of the forge so that I can play around with the geometry on the grinder, which is great because that means I have a little bit of control. And he has thrown his maker's mark in there, so we know where it came from. But all that needs to be done to this at this stage is to profile grind, just true up a few of the lines, and then do the bevels and flats, and she'll be ready to heat treat. So I'll show you the grinding process and then we'll get into how I do a Hamon. Okay, so now that the blade is ground to 120 grit, ready for heat treatment, it's still a little bit thick. It will need post-heat treat grinding, but not very much. The thinner you go, the more active the Hormone will be. Now obviously the thinner you go, the more risk you run of cracking it, which is why I go to 120 rather than 40 grit or files or anything like that. But at this stage, it's ready to have the clay applied. Now, if you ask 100 knife makers how to make a Hamon, you'll probably get 100 different answers. There are varied techniques out there, but this is my favored technique, and I'll go into a couple of approaches that are different to mine. Now, my Hamon clay of choice is Satanite. Now I have it in a large bucket, but Satanite is a very fine powder, very light powder, and it's also very fine mesh. As you can see, it smooths out really nicely, very fine. But it can also be done with something like this Davco Lanco 156, which is a high temperature refractory mortar. I've also done this with natural clay, although you have to get a natural clay that doesn't have a lot of rocks and stones in it. The finer the mesh of the piece, of the clay, the better. Now this is the Lanco 156, and as you can see, it smooths out quite nicely. It does tend to have little grit pieces in it and clumps. You can see little white dots, hopefully, in there, but this is probably the second best option. I'll try and get a better angle on this. So here we have the Satanite, and here we have the Lanco 156. Both of them do a perfectly good job of making Hamones, as well as natural clay. If you have natural clay, you can also mix it with charcoal. There are various mixes out there for Hamon clay, but I just tend to use straight Satanite. Now, in order to make the mix, I tend to have a two-part box like this, plastic container. You could use two Chinese takeaway boxes, or you could use two little bowls or something like that. I normally want two separate things because my Hamon making, and lots of Hamon making, tends to be in two stages. And we'll go into that now. I'm just going to trade out all of this rubbish. Now the reason you want two pots is because you're going to mix two different consistencies of your clay. One is going to be a really runny consistency, what normal potters would call a slip, and the other one is going to be a much more dense version of the same clay. And that's going to be for the actual Hamon. So what I'm going to do is add maybe 2 spoonfuls of the Satanite to this. I'm going to be making way too much Hamon clay, but I'm hoping I can seal this up and not lose too much moisture over time. You can buy Satanite pre-mixed. We'll get some water in there. Now, like I said, this is going to be a really runny consistency. It's going to be pretty much water with a little bit of Satanite suspended in it. And you're going to mix that thoroughly. The less contaminants you have in your mix, the better. So the less rocks and sticks and weeds and stuff like that. If you can avoid having those in the mix, all the better. All of your tools should be relatively clean and all that kind of stuff. You want to keep cleanliness at the forefront of your priorities. And then once we've made the slip, we're going to make a far more dense version. Again, I'm going to use 2 spoonfuls, and we're just going to tip a tiny little bit of water in there. Might be a little bit too much. What we want is the consistency of, a thick soup. It's actually pretty good. And I'll come back when I've mixed this thoroughly. So now that I have my 2 clay mixes, my first step is going to be to soak this in the light mix. I want a consistent coating, an even consistent coating of the light clay mix all over the surface of this blade. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the clay is clinging to some spots and not to others. And I did this on purpose because there are some oils from my hands and from the grinder and stuff like that on the blade that are not allowing this to stick. So what I'm going to do is hit this quickly with some acetone or some degreaser, and then I'll come back and show you how it changes. Okay, so I've hit it with some degreaser and I've hit it with some paper towel, and as you can see, the clay is clinging to it really well now. I find that if you have any spots that are still not allowing the clay to stick, if you just abrade it with the clay using your finger, you can get it to cling perfectly and get a nice even coat. Now this is, again, really thin coat. You're not actually making the Hamon at this stage. It should be thin and even all the way around. And what this is doing is A, protecting the steel from oxidization during the heat treat, because the clay will protect the steel. It also increases the surface area, because there's all these little granules in it, it increases the surface area of the steel, which means that the areas that are not covered by the large, thick amounts of clay will actually cool faster than even if they were just bare. And this is actually a method that the Japanese use to heat treat kitchen knives and stuff, is that they will actually apply a thin layer of clay to all of their blades. They won't apply a Hamon line of clay, but they will apply a thin layer like this to all of their blades to increase that surface area to speed up the quench to get an even higher hardness out of their steels. So what I got to do now is allow this to dry, and then once it's dry, it will act like the wire in a wire Hamon, where you use baling wire or something to hold the Hamon clay on. This will provide that tacky surface for the Hamon clay to stick to. The advantage of this one over the Hamon wire is that you don't have that bulky wire creating thick lumps, and therefore you can get much finer detail in your Hamon. You can do this process in reverse by applying the Hamon clay first and then using a brush to apply the finer clay afterwards to fill in the gaps between the ashy lines. But I find, especially on small stuff and fine detail Hamons, I end up breaking the ashy off when I'm brushing the smaller stuff on. So this process for me has been my most desired. So once this dries to the point that it's tacky, I can then hit it with a torch very, very lightly. I'm not even going to touch it with the flame. I'm just going to heat it up. A heat gun would work really well. Or if you hang it over your charcoal forge or your gas forge, then you don't want anything to contact it because you don't want to ruin that layer of clay. But you want it to dry out almost completely. It doesn't have to be 100% dry, but you want it to be fairly dry before you apply the layer of Hamon clay. What can happen is that the satenite will shrink and you'll see cracks appear on your clay surface. If that happens, you need to reapply your layer of slip. You don't need to knock off the rest, but you just need to reapply to fill in those cracks, because you don't want bare metal being laid out. So I'll come back when this is dried out enough for me to apply the Hamon clay. A quick tip if you want to dry something vertically is to simply use one of these small grip clamps to act as a pedestal or act as a passes of a tripod to keep the blade elevated away from anything that could touch the Hamon. And this way it's not going to fall over because it's got that nice support on either side. Okay, so as you can see here, the clay is completely dried. I hit it with a torch a little bit. It did shrink back from the spine corners a little bit. Not sure if you're going to be able to see that. Focus camera, there you go. But I'm not too worried about that because that's about to get a layer of clay on it. So now that we've got the fine layer of clay ready to protect the blade and obviously increase that surface area, we need to apply our main Hamon clay. Now our main Hamon clay is the consistency of kind of a very thick soup, like pea and ham soup. And my applicator is just a pop stick. I buy them like in packs of 50 from arts and crafts stores or big bulk stores and stuff like that. And these are invaluable in the workshop for mixing epoxies and obviously for mixing Hamon clay. When I apply my Hamon, one of the big things you don't want to do is to slap on a huge thick layer of clay. The layer of clay should actually only be maybe 1/8 of an inch at maximum, and that's quite thick for a Hamon. Given that this is such a small blade, it's not going to take a lot of clay to do. And I'm working around the tripod at the moment. You do want to clay into your tang. Clay all the way back. You want to create an even layer, and you can see it's not actually that thick. One of the biggest issues I have with a lot of the Hamon how-tos is that they tend to have people who use half-inch thick layers of clay. Now, because I don't want this to develop any kind of saber or sori, which is a sweep towards the spine, like Japanese katana do, I actually clear the clay from the back. I leave that thin layer, but I don't want a thick layer at the back. If you want your blade to curve, you cover the spine. We're just going to apply on this side, again covering that ricasso. This is difficult to do. And you want to have your coverings be equal on both sides. If it's unequal, then you'll end up with warping after quench. Though Hamon bearing blades actually tend to be easier to straighten out of the quench because they have a softened portion. And you can wipe off excess, like I just did there. I'm going to do along the harpoon, because I want the harpoon to harden. Not that this harpoon will be sharpened, I just like the effect of having a hardening line there. And that is basically a little thick. That is basically your baseline of Hamon clay. Now you could leave it like that and that would give you a nice straight-ish Hamon. Obviously it's a little lumpy and that's fine, it's going to give you a little bit of activity. But it doesn't need to be this lumpy, you could make it very straight. Nice even thickness. Doesn't matter if the ricasso is a little bit thicker than the rest, because the ricasso is obviously thicker material as well. But what I'm going to do is lay in some ashy lines, and in order to do that I'm going to have to reorient the camera. So in order to apply ashy, I have a special tool, which is actually a beveled piece of popsicle stick. You can see that I've made it beveled. So it's got a nice thin edge, especially on this really fine stuff. That's very important. And what I need to do is I need to put a layer of clay along that entire edge. So I'm just going to lay out some here. I've used a garbage bag to protect my my board. What I'm going to do is just lay lines of clay. Need to wet that a little bit. A large dollop. I'm going to lay lines of clay going down to the edge, and you'll notice that these are very thin. Now I'm not going to do anything particularly adventurous here, but they do travel all the way down to the edge. You want them to be around the same place if you're doing such a simple design as I am. So you just look at your other side, get your bearings, and lay in your lines. And I'll come back when the ashy are all laid in. So here we are with all of the ashy laid in and the spine covered. It's actually almost doubled the width of the blade, but that's more than thick enough for what we want to do. Now I'm actually going to let this dry overnight. You don't have to do that. You could just let it dry in again until it's tacky like the underlayer, and then slowly heat it over the charcoal forge, or slowly hang it in front of the gas forge, flicking it back and forth to slowly dry it out. What you don't want to do is try and dry it quickly, because what will happen is the clay will immediately pop off. But once this is dry, tomorrow I'll come back and we will quench this thing. Something I forgot to mention is I tend to normalize before I then do my claying, but this time I forgot, so I normalized while I had the clay on. And in the next shot you'll actually be able to see how the clay holds on to heat. So as you'll be able to see in this shot, the clay is obviously holding on to a lot more heat than the rest of the blade is, slowing that cooling down, and that's what's going to create our Hamon when we go to quench. So the ashy do slow down the cooling slightly, but they do cool down about the same rate as the blade because they are so thin in cross-section. As always, you preheat your oil, but in this case you're going to overheat your oil from what you would normally do because you're wanting this oil to prevent overcooling from the water and prevent cracking. I also preheat my water. Warm water will less likely crack a blade than cold, though you don't want it close to boiling or anything like that because that'll create too much of a steam jacket and you won't harden at all. And here we go, we're going for an interrupted water quench. So you'll notice that I come out of the forge, straight into the water, and then after about 2 seconds, straight into the oil to slow that cooling down. This means that I'm less likely to crack the blade, and luckily I didn't crack this blade. But you will notice that as I quenched in the water, the Satanite shrunk back and started to crack off from the blade, and that's totally normal. That doesn't mean that you won't get a Hamon. If the clay falls off before you quench, then that will prevent a Hamon, but as you'll see, I'll knock off the clay right here with my tongs, and that nice kind of clear line between the edge and the spine where the clay was is a pretty good indicator of Hamon. Now I'm finished grinding, and I'm starting off with a 240 grit equivalent. It's an A60 belt, I believe, Trizact, and this will go straight to hand sanding from there. On a larger blade I might go to 400, but because this was so small I didn't want to overheat the blade, because if you do ruin your temper in this case, you also ruin the Hamon, because the Hamon is the differentiation between hard material and soft. So I ground this to a 240 grit finish, and then we go to hand sanding. So, here we are. We have the finished ground blade, and at this stage in the grinding, I'll bring the light closer, you can't actually see the Hamon. Sometimes you can, but other times you can't. But what will show the Hamon is when we start the hand sanding. Now I've already started the hand sanding on this one, but even at this 320 grit, you should be able to start seeing, if I play the light on it correctly, there we are, ever so faintly, the start of the Hamon. Now, being that this is such a small blade and I didn't want to go overboard with the ashy lines, it's only got a small amount of activity, but I'm looking forward to seeing if I can pull that out of the blade. So I've already started with 320 grit. I'm going to do this side at 320 grit, and then we'll move on to 600, 1200, 1500, 2000, and then 2500. I sanded in alternating grits all the way to 3000, and this was a clean 3000, straight pulls down the blade. You can see it's almost a mirror. The higher the grit you go, the more activity you're going to get. It's got some finger smudges on it, but that's not going to hurt it. Now this is where approaches can differ. Some people will use very dilute ferric chloride and do small soaks intermittently. Some will use just lemon juice, some will use just vinegar, some will use other acids like hydrochloric or phosphoric acid. I stumbled across this kind of combination through another YouTuber who I can't remember the name of. He's no longer active. But I found that the vinegar turned the hardened sections dark, and the lemon juice tended to turn the unhardened sections dark. And between them, they both brought out that really bright white line of the Hamon. And so I switch between the two, using vinegar until it starts to darken the blade, and then switching out to the vinegar to the lemon juice to darken out the blade. And you switch back and forth, and you'll start to see a significant change in the blade. Now, the higher polish you have, the longer this takes to happen. But if you continually rub, then you're removing slight surface oxides and continuing to get a nice, even, shallow edge. You can see here that the blade is actually significantly darkened. You can see that Hamon line starting to show, and I'm switching between the acids more frequently, just trying to chase that look that I'm looking for. One of the big problems with using ferric chloride or any kind of stronger acid is that you can over-etch the blade and ruin that beautiful polish that you've just put on there. What I really like is that semi-traditional look of a highly polished blade with the Hamon shining through. In order to achieve that mirror look with the Hamon shining through, I use this metal polish. You can use Mother's Mag or Autosol, but it's got to be a very light abrasive, very light polish, just to remove those surface oxides. And this can be a little bit of a difficult process, takes a little while. And I'll do this every, 15-20 minutes of etching, I'll do a polish. So you can see here that it's a little bit darker than it was the last time I polished. And I won't entirely chase out all of these oxides in this polishing step. I'll only do that in the last one. And I tend to do normally 3 cycles, sometimes 4, until I'm really happy with how the Hamon looks and if I'm getting that activity that I want. One of the big things to remember is that you can't use a buffing wheel on a Hamon. You will literally strip the Hamon from the surface. You can buff before you try and go for the Hamon with the etching, but it tends to be less reliable than doing by hand because you want the pores of the steel to be open. Okay, so after a 3rd etch cycle and some polishing, we have our final result. Doesn't look like much until you turn it. Now this side has some amazing action going on thanks to those ashy. Yeah, those really cool ghosts in the martensite and in the perlite above the Hamon. It's difficult to get decent action on such a small blade, especially one that's relatively thick. And as you can see on this side, if I can get the camera to goddamn focus, there's a little bit of action right near where the light is right now. A little tiny spot, but the rest of it's fairly normal. It still needs a little bit of polishing. Come on, camera. Yeah, you can see a little bit of smudging, but the majority of it is that mirror polish. This side's a little bit better, actually. And I'm glad, kind of happy that the happy coincidence that the side with the most action is the side that has Alex's maker's mark on it. So there you go. That's how I go about making a Hamon. I'd like to thank Alex from Valhalla Ironworks, my fellow Forgecast host, for forging this blade and sending it to me with the challenge of making a Hamon on it. And I hope that I lived up to the lived up to the challenge. Hopefully this will help you guys when you make Hamons. As I will have said earlier in the video, there is a lot of different ways to make Hamons, and there are a lot of different ways to bring out the the subtleties of it, but this is my preferred way. You might find a different way that works for you. I would also like to say a huge thank you to my patrons, who I will point to with my knife over here. These guys keep my channel running, and without them I couldn't make educational videos like this, teaching people how to make hormones and spending my days ruining my sanity trying to chase them myself. If you want to join the Patreon family and get access to behind-the-scenes videos and all kinds of other cool content, then all you have to do is click the link in the description below, and there'll be a link there. While you're there, you might want to hit that like button to let me know that you liked this video, or subscribe and find out when I make new videos. I make videos every Wednesday, and I have a live stream every Saturday. So if you want to see more content from me, hit subscribe, make sure to hit the bell notification icon so that YouTube will tell you when I upload a new video. And I hope you have a fantastic week. Cheers, guys.